The tropical sun beat down mercilessly on the dense jungle canopy of Guyana, its humid air thick with the scent of rotting vegetation and unfulfilled dreams. Deep within this green maze, hidden from the world's watchful eyes, lay a settlement that would become synonymous with unimaginable horror. Jonestown, they called it, a name that would forever echo through the corridors of history as the site of the largest mass murder-suicide in modern times. On November 18, 1978, the world would wake to news so shocking, so incomprehensible, that many initially refused to believe it. 918 people, men, women, and children, lay dead in the sweltering heat of the Guyanese jungle, their bodies scattered like broken dolls across the dirt pathways of what was supposed to be their paradise. Among them were nearly 300 children, their small faces peaceful in death, unaware of the betrayal that had stolen their futures. The man responsible for this unthinkable tragedy was James Warren Jones, a charismatic preacher who had promised his followers a utopia free from racism, poverty, and persecution. Instead, he delivered them to their graves, orchestrating what would become known as the Jonestown Massacre, a name that would haunt the collective memory of humanity for generations to come. Jim Jones was born on May 13, 1931, in the small farming town of Crete, Indiana, to a disabled World War I veteran and an ambitious mother who worked in a factory. From his earliest days, young Jim displayed an unsettling fascination with death and religion, conducting mock funeral services for dead animals and preaching to other children with an intensity that made adults uncomfortable. His childhood was marked by poverty, isolation, and a growing obsession with power and control that would later manifest in the most devastating ways. The boy who once staged elaborate funerals for roadkill in his backyard would grow into a man who could convince nearly 1,000 people to follow him to their deaths. His transformation from a troubled child to a cult leader began in earnest when he discovered his gift for oratory and his ability to manipulate people's deepest fears and desires. Jones understood that people were searching for belonging, for purpose, for someone to tell them they were special and chosen. He became that someone, weaving a web of lies so intricate and compelling that even the most skeptical found themselves drawn into his orbit. In 1955, Jones founded the People's Temple in Indianapolis, Indiana, beginning what would become a decades-long journey toward ultimate darkness. His early ministry appeared progressive and inclusive, welcoming people of all races at a time when segregation was still deeply entrenched in American society. Jones preached racial equality and social justice, adopting children of different ethnicities and presenting his congregation as a rainbow family that transcended traditional boundaries. This facade of progressiveness attracted idealistic followers who genuinely believed they were part of something revolutionary and good. The temple's congregation grew rapidly as Jones's reputation as a healer and prophet spread throughout the community. He performed what appeared to be miraculous healings during services, pulling bloody tissue from people's bodies and claiming to cure cancer and other diseases. What his followers didn't know was that these healings were elaborate hoaxes, with Jones planting raw chicken livers and other animal parts to create the illusion of extracting tumors and diseased tissue. His staff would research congregation members' medical histories and personal problems, feeding Jones information that he would later use to demonstrate his supernatural powers of knowledge and healing. As the civil rights movement gained momentum in the 1960s, Jones positioned himself as a champion of social justice, using his platform to advocate for racial integration and economic equality. He opened soup kitchens, provided free medical care, and established nursing homes for the elderly. On the surface, the People's Temple appeared to be a force for positive change in the community. However, beneath this veneer of righteousness, Jones was carefully cultivating a culture of absolute devotion and unquestioning obedience. The seeds of destruction were planted early in the temple's history. Jones demanded that his followers surrender their personal autonomy, their possessions, and ultimately their lives to his vision. He instituted a system of public confessions and humiliations, forcing members to admit to real or imagined sins before the entire congregation. Those who questioned his authority or showed signs of disloyalty were subjected to brutal punishments, including beatings, sleep deprivation, and psychological torture. Children were separated from their parents and taught to view Jones as their true father, creating a generation of young people who knew no loyalty beyond their leader's twisted will. As paranoia and delusions of grandeur consumed Jones's mind, he began speaking of a great conspiracy against him and his followers. He claimed that government agents were plotting to destroy the temple and that nuclear war was imminent. His solution was to create a sanctuary in a remote location where his people could live in peace and safety. In 1974, Jones began developing a settlement in the South American nation of Guyana, purchasing land in the dense jungle and promising his followers a socialist paradise where they could build a new society free from the corruption and violence of the outside world. The settlement, which Jones modestly named Jonestown after himself, was marketed to potential residents as an agricultural utopia where racial harmony would flourish and everyone would contribute according to their abilities. Promotional materials showed smiling families working together in lush gardens, children playing happily in the tropical sun, and community members enjoying abundant harvests from their collective labor. The reality, however, was starkly different from these idealized images. As the first settlers arrived in Guyana in 1975, they discovered that their promised paradise was little more than a collection of crude wooden buildings surrounded by impenetrable jungle. The work was backbreaking, the conditions primitive, and the isolation complete. Jones had chosen the location specifically for its remoteness, knowing that once his followers were there, they would have nowhere to run. The nearest town was hours away through dangerous jungle terrain, and the settlement was heavily guarded by armed loyalists who had been ordered to prevent anyone from leaving. Life in Jonestown was a carefully orchestrated nightmare designed to break down individual identity and resistance. Residents were awakened before dawn by loudspeakers blaring Jones's voice, subjected to 16-hour workdays in the sweltering heat, and given barely enough food to maintain their strength. Privacy was non-existent, with guards monitoring every conversation and reporting any signs of dissent to Jones's inner circle. Sexual relationships were forbidden except with Jones's explicit permission, and families were deliberately separated to prevent the formation of loyalties that might compete with devotion to the leader. The psychological manipulation was as systematic as it was cruel. Jones used a combination of sleep deprivation, malnutrition, and constant fear to maintain control over his followers. He staged fake emergencies and attacks on the settlement, claiming that government forces or hostile locals were preparing to assault the community. These white nights, as they were called, would see the entire population awakened in the middle of the night and forced to take defensive positions around the settlement. The exhausted residents would spend hours in a state of terror, waiting for an attack that never came, while Jones used their fear to reinforce his narrative of persecution and the need for absolute unity. Children in Jonestown faced particular horrors. They were separated from their parents at an early age and housed in communal dormitories where they were subjected to physical and sexual abuse by Jones and his deputies. Education consisted primarily of indoctrination, with children taught to view Jones as a divine figure and the outside world as evil and corrupt. Those who showed signs of independence or questioned the community's rules were subjected to brutal punishments, including being forced to spend nights in a dark well where they were terrorized by stories of monsters and demons. The physical conditions in Jonestown deteriorated rapidly as more residents arrived and resources became scarce. The tropical climate, combined with poor sanitation and inadequate medical care, led to widespread disease and malnutrition. Residents suffered from dysentery, malaria, and a host of other illnesses that went untreated due to the lack of proper medical facilities. The elderly and infirm were particularly vulnerable, with many dying from preventable conditions while Jones continued to promise that better times were coming. As reports of abuse and poor conditions began to filter back to the United States, concerned family members and former temple members launched a campaign to expose the truth about Jonestown. They contacted journalists, government officials, and anyone who would listen, describing the horrors they had witnessed or heard about from their loved ones. However, Jones had spent years building relationships with politicians and community leaders, using the temple's reputation for social justice work to deflect criticism and maintain his public image as a progressive religious leader. The pressure on Jones intensified throughout 1978 as more defectors came forward with shocking accounts of life in Jonestown. Former residents described a community where armed guards prevented escape, where children were abused and terrorized, and where Jones had begun talking openly about the need for his followers to be willing to die for their cause. These testimonies painted a picture of a leader who had completely lost touch with reality and a community that had become a prison for its unwilling residents. Congressman Leo Ryan, a principled politician from California known for his hands-on approach to investigating problems, began receiving reports about Jonestown from concerned constituents whose family members had disappeared into the jungle settlement. Ryan was particularly disturbed by accounts of children being held against their will and subjected to abuse. Unlike many politicians who might have been content to issue statements or hold hearings, Ryan decided to see the situation for himself. He organized a fact-finding mission to Guyana, bringing with him a team of journalists and concerned relatives who hoped to make contact with their loved ones. The decision to visit Jonestown was not made lightly. Ryan and his team were aware that they might be walking into a dangerous situation, but they believed that the potential to save lives outweighed the risks. The congressman had built his career on standing up for the powerless and holding the powerful accountable, and he saw the situation in Jonestown as exactly the kind of injustice that demanded his attention. His staff included Jackie Spear, a dedicated 28-year-old aide who shared Ryan's commitment to protecting vulnerable people from exploitation and abuse. As Ryan's delegation prepared for their journey to Guyana, Jones frantically attempted to present Jonestown in the best possible light. He ordered his followers to clean the settlement, prepare elaborate meals, and rehearse responses to potential questions from the visitors. The residents were threatened with severe punishment if they revealed the true conditions in the community or expressed any desire to leave. Jones himself was consuming massive quantities of drugs to cope with his paranoia and delusions, making him increasingly unpredictable and dangerous. On November 17, 1978, Congressman Ryan and his delegation arrived in Georgetown, Guyana's capital city, where they were met with a mixture of cooperation and hostility from local officials. The Guyanese government had been receiving payments from the People's Temple and was reluctant to interfere with what they saw as an internal American matter. However, international pressure and the presence of a United States congressman forced them to provide at least minimal assistance to the visiting delegation. The journey from Georgetown to Jonestown was a harrowing experience that took the delegation deep into the jungle on rutted dirt roads that barely deserved the name. The oppressive heat and humidity, combined with the dense vegetation that seemed to close in around them, created an atmosphere of isolation and vulnerability that grew stronger with each mile they traveled. The journalists accompanying Ryan documented their journey, creating a record of what would be their final hours for some of them. The few survivors of the airstrip massacre were left to wait in the jungle heat for 22 hours before help arrived. They huddled together among the bodies of their fallen companions, fighting off insects and the tropical heat while their untreated wounds slowly festered. The psychological trauma of watching their friends and colleagues die in such a brutal manner was compounded by the uncertainty of whether they would survive to tell their story. Some of the wounded died during the long wait, their lives ebbing away in the remote jungle clearing where they had hoped to find freedom. While the delegation was being murdered at the airstrip, an even greater horror was unfolding back at Jonestown. Jones, his paranoia and delusions now completely consuming him, gathered his followers in the central pavilion of the settlement. The crude wooden structure, which had served as the community's meeting place and dining hall, was about to become the site of history's largest mass murder-suicide. The leader who had promised his followers paradise was about to deliver them to their graves. The death ritual that Jones had planned was not a spontaneous act of desperation, but a carefully orchestrated event that he had been preparing for months. He had conducted rehearsals, which he called White Nights, where residents were forced to drink what they were told was poison as a test of their loyalty. These practice sessions had desensitized the community to the idea of death and had identified those who might resist when the time came for the real thing. Jones had also stockpiled the materials needed for the massacre, including large quantities of cyanide and flavor aid, a powdered drink mix that would be used to mask the bitter taste of the poison. As the residents gathered in the pavilion, many of them still unaware of what was about to happen, Jones began his final speech. His voice, once capable of inspiring and comforting his followers, now carried only madness and death. He spoke of the attack on the delegation, claiming that it would bring the wrath of the American government down upon their community. He painted a picture of inevitable persecution and torture, convincing his followers that death was preferable to the suffering that awaited them if they remained alive. The poison had been prepared in advance, mixed in a large vat with flavor aid to create a deadly cocktail that would kill quickly and efficiently. Jones called it revolutionary suicide, claiming that their deaths would be a final act of defiance against the forces of oppression and racism. He convinced his followers that they were dying for a noble cause, that their sacrifice would inspire others to continue the fight for social justice and equality. The tragic irony was that many of these people had joined the People's Temple precisely because they believed in these ideals, never imagining that their commitment to justice would lead them to their deaths. The first to die were the children, their parents forced to administer the poison to their own sons and daughters. The sight of parents murdering their children was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the entire tragedy, as mothers and fathers who had spent their lives protecting and nurturing their offspring instead became the instruments of their destruction. The children, trusting and innocent, drank the poison without understanding what was happening to them. Their small bodies convulsed as the cyanide took effect, their cries of pain and confusion echoing through the pavilion as their parents watched in horror. Some residents attempted to resist, recognizing the madness of what Jones was demanding. However, they were quickly overwhelmed by armed guards who had been positioned throughout the pavilion to prevent any escape attempts. Those who refused to drink the poison willingly were forcibly injected with it, their struggles ending in death as the cyanide coursed through their veins. The guards themselves were not immune to the poison, many of them taking their own lives after ensuring that others had died first. The elderly residents of Jonestown, many of whom had devoted their life savings and their final years to Jones's cause, faced their deaths with a mixture of resignation and confusion. They had trusted their leader completely, believing that he would protect them and provide for them in their golden years. Instead, they found themselves dying in agony in a remote jungle, far from the families and communities they had left behind. Their final moments were marked by the realization that their faith had been betrayed and their lives wasted on a lie. As the poison spread through the crowd, the pavilion became a scene of unimaginable horror. Bodies lay everywhere, contorted in the final agony of cyanide poisoning. The smell of death began to permeate the humid air, mixing with the tropical scents of the jungle to create an atmosphere of decay and despair. The sounds of crying and moaning gradually faded as more and more residents succumbed to the poison, leaving only the buzzing of insects and the distant calls of jungle birds to mark the passing of so many lives. Jones himself survived longer than most of his followers, apparently taking his own life with a gunshot to the head only after ensuring that the mass murder had been completed. Whether he shot himself or was killed by one of his deputies remains unclear, but his death marked the end of one of the most destructive cult movements in human history. The man who had promised to save his followers from the evils of the world had instead become the architect of their destruction, leaving behind a legacy of death and betrayal that would haunt the survivors and their families for generations. The scene that greeted rescue workers when they finally reached Jonestown on November 19, 1978, was beyond anything they could have imagined. Bodies lay scattered across the settlement, many of them still locked in their final embraces as families had died together. The air was thick with the smell of decomposition in the tropical heat, and the buzzing of insects was the only sound to break the eerie silence that had fallen over the abandoned community. The rescuers, hardened by their experience with disasters and tragedies, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the carnage and the evident suffering of the victims. Among the dead were 304 children, ranging from infants to teenagers who had their entire lives ahead of them. These young victims had been given no choice in their fate, murdered by the adults who were supposed to protect them. Their small bodies, scattered throughout the settlement, served as a heartbreaking reminder of the innocence that had been destroyed by Jones's madness. Many of the children had been born in Jonestown or had spent their entire lives in the settlement, knowing no other world than the one their parents had chosen for them. The only survivor found in Jonestown was Hyacinth Thrash, a 76-year-old woman who had slept through the entire massacre in her cabin. She awoke to find her community transformed into a necropolis, her friends and neighbors all dead around her. Her survival was a miracle, but it came at the cost of witnessing the aftermath of the greatest tragedy in the history of religious movements. Her testimony would later provide crucial insights into the final days of Jonestown and the psychological manipulation that had made such a tragedy possible. The task of identifying and removing the bodies from Jonestown was enormous and heartbreaking. Many of the victims had been disfigured by the tropical heat and the effects of the poison, making identification difficult. Families in the United States waited anxiously for news of their loved ones, hoping against hope that their relatives might have somehow survived the massacre. The process of returning the bodies to their families was complicated by the remote location of Jonestown and the sheer number of victims, leading to delays and confusion that added to the grief of the survivors. The psychological impact of the Jonestown Massacre extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The entire concept of religious freedom and the right to follow one's conscience was called into question as people struggled to understand how such a tragedy could have occurred. The massacre also highlighted the vulnerability of people seeking meaning and belonging in their lives, and the devastating consequences that could result from placing absolute trust in charismatic leaders who claimed to have all the answers. The survivors of the People's Temple, both those who had left before the massacre and those who had been away from Jonestown when it occurred, faced a lifetime of guilt and trauma. Many blamed themselves for not doing more to prevent the tragedy or for not being able to save their loved ones. The stigma associated with having been part of the People's Temple followed them for years, making it difficult to rebuild their lives and find acceptance in their communities. The children who survived the massacre, particularly those who had lost their parents and siblings, faced unique challenges in processing their trauma and building new lives. Many of them had been raised in the insular world of the People's Temple and had difficulty adapting to mainstream society. The psychological scars left by their experiences in Jonestown would affect them for the rest of their lives, influencing their relationships, their careers, and their ability to trust others. The investigation into the Jonestown Massacre revealed the extent of Jones's manipulation and control over his followers. Financial records showed that he had amassed millions of dollars in assets while his followers lived in poverty and deprivation. The pharmaceutical supplies found in his personal quarters indicated that he had been consuming massive quantities of drugs, including amphetamines and barbiturates, which had likely contributed to his paranoid delusions and erratic behavior. The role of the Guyanese government in enabling the tragedy also came under scrutiny. Officials had received reports of abuse and poor conditions in Jonestown but had failed to investigate or take action to protect the residents. The payments that the People's Temple had made to government officials and the jobs that the settlement had provided for local workers had created a web of complicity that had allowed Jones to operate with impunity. The media coverage of the Jonestown Massacre was extensive but often sensationalized, focusing on the more shocking aspects of the tragedy while failing to explore the deeper psychological and social factors that had made it possible. The term "drinking the Kool-Aid," which became a popular expression for blind obedience to authority, was actually based on a misunderstanding of the facts, as the poison had been mixed with flavor aid rather than Kool-Aid. This kind of inaccuracy, while seemingly minor, contributed to the mythologizing of the tragedy and the failure to understand its true lessons. The legal aftermath of the Jonestown Massacre was limited by the fact that the primary perpetrator was dead and the crime had occurred in a foreign country. Some members of Jones's inner circle who had survived the massacre were prosecuted for their roles in the murders, but the sentences were relatively light given the magnitude of the crimes. The families of the victims filed civil lawsuits against the People's Temple and its remaining assets, but the legal proceedings dragged on for years and provided little closure for those who had lost loved ones. The psychological profiles of cult members and their susceptibility to manipulation became a subject of intense study in the aftermath of Jonestown. Researchers found that the victims were not the mentally unstable or gullible people that popular stereotypes suggested, but rather individuals who had been seeking meaning, community, and social justice in their lives. Many of them were well-educated, successful people who had been attracted to the People's Temple's message of racial equality and social activism. Their involvement in the movement and their ultimate fate demonstrated that anyone could become a victim of psychological manipulation under the right circumstances. The tragedy of Jonestown also highlighted the dangers of absolute power and the importance of maintaining checks and balances in any organization or community. Jones's ability to control every aspect of his followers' lives, from their finances to their personal relationships, had created a situation where dissent was impossible and resistance was futile. The isolation of the Jonestown settlement had further enabled his control by cutting off his followers from outside sources of information and support. The lessons of Jonestown continue to resonate today as new religious movements and charismatic leaders emerge around the world. The warning signs of potentially dangerous groups, including demands for absolute loyalty, isolation from family and friends, surrender of personal assets, and punishment for questioning authority, are now well documented and widely recognized. However, the continued existence of destructive cults and the regular occurrence of smaller-scale tragedies demonstrate that the lessons of Jonestown have not been fully learned or applied. The memory of the 918 people who died in Jonestown serves as a somber reminder of the human capacity for both good and evil. Many of the victims had been motivated by noble ideals and a genuine desire to make the world a better place. Their tragedy lies not in their intentions but in their misplaced trust in a leader who exploited their idealism for his own twisted purposes. The children who died in Jonestown were perhaps the most innocent victims of all, murdered by the adults who should have protected them and denied the chance to grow up and make their own choices about their lives and beliefs. The survivors of the Jonestown Massacre, both those who escaped the settlement and those who lost loved ones in the tragedy, continue to bear witness to the events of November 18, 1978. Their testimonies serve as a crucial reminder of the human cost of unchecked power and the importance of maintaining critical thinking and personal autonomy in the face of charismatic authority. Their courage in speaking out about their experiences has helped others recognize the warning signs of dangerous groups and avoid similar tragedies. The site of Jonestown itself has been largely reclaimed by the jungle, with only a few concrete foundations and rusted metal remnants marking the location where so many lives were lost. The tropical vegetation has grown over the pathways where children once played and families once lived, but the memory of what happened there remains vivid in the minds of those who survived and those who study the tragedy. The silence of the jungle has replaced the sounds of daily life, but the echoes of that terrible day continue to resonate through history. The Jonestown Massacre stands as one of the darkest chapters in the history of religious movements, a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute faith in fallible human leaders. The tragedy serves as a reminder that the search for meaning and belonging, while a fundamental human need, can be exploited by those who seek power and control over others. The 918 people who died in Jonestown were not weak or foolish, but rather individuals who had placed their trust in someone who proved unworthy of it. Their deaths were not a failure of their characters, but a failure of the systems and safeguards that should have protected them from such exploitation. The story of Jonestown is ultimately a story about the power of human connection and the tragic consequences when that power is perverted and abused. The people who followed Jim Jones to Guyana were seeking community, purpose, and a better world for their children. Instead, they found death in a remote jungle, victims of one man's megalomania and the collective failure of society to protect the vulnerable from predators who cloak themselves in religious authority. Their memory serves as a warning to future generations about the price of uncritical devotion and the importance of maintaining individual autonomy in the face of collective pressure. As we remember the victims of Jonestown, we honor not only their lives but also the lessons their deaths have taught us about human nature, the abuse of power, and the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Their tragedy reminds us that freedom of religion must be balanced with the protection of individual rights, and that the search for spiritual meaning must never come at the cost of human dignity and autonomy. The children who died in Jonestown will never have the chance to grow up and make their own choices about their lives and beliefs, but their memory can serve to protect other children from similar fates. The reverberations of November 18, 1978, continue to influence our understanding of cults, religious extremism, and the psychology of group manipulation. The date marks not just the end of 918 lives, but the beginning of a new awareness about the dangers of unchecked religious authority and the importance of maintaining critical thinking in spiritual matters. The victims of Jonestown did not die in vain if their sacrifice helps prevent future tragedies and protects others from the kind of exploitation and abuse they suffered. In the end, the Jonestown Massacre serves as a stark reminder that the capacity for both tremendous good and unspeakable evil exists within human nature. The people who died in Guyana were not fundamentally different from anyone else. They were ordinary individuals who had extraordinary things done to them by a leader who had lost all sense of humanity and moral responsibility. Their story is our story, and their fate could have been our fate under different circumstances. This recognition should inspire not judgment but compassion, not superiority but humility, and not forgetting but remembering, always remembering, so that such a tragedy never happens again.